Hello, everybody, and welcome to another hair-raising, fun-filled, expeditious episode of Radiorama, where, as the name implies, I show you how to work on radios, sometimes television, sometimes stereo systems. You just never know around here. It depends on what comes across the workbench and what gets donated to our little museum here in Alameda, California. And today we have a Zenith model, and of course I forgot the model name already, like it matters, model A15Y. Clock radio, typical 5-tube design. This style was very popular with Zenith. They made this for a number of years in a number of configurations. I don't know what the years, but it's got to be post-1955 because we have the civil defense markers here and there. And in the U.S., what that meant was if we were imminently about to be bombed by a nuclear bomb from the Ruskies, then that meant to tune into those stations for information like where your closest bomb shelter was and stuff like that. They only used it until about 1963 because after that, we didn't have to worry about planes dropping the bombs. We had to worry about supersonic missiles. At that point, you only had about 20 minutes. No need for civil defense. Everyone's going to be dead. I know that sounds gruesome, but anyway, the clock works on it. I don't know about the radio, but being a Zenith, and as I've mentioned many times on this station, they tend to be pretty reliable, and most of the time they just still work. Before I get started, you'll probably see I have a can of Anchor Brewing Company beer here, and there's a lot of microbreweries in the U.S. right now. I think there's over 6,500 right now, so there's a lot to choose from. But Anchor has been around in one form or another for close to 150 years. As of yesterday, they announced that they are closing their doors, so there will be no more Anchor Steam beer. In fact, I tried to buy their Steam beer, sold out. So cheers to everybody at Anchor. I hope you all find good jobs, or maybe someone else buys the company. I guess it was owned by some huge conglomerate, and that conglomerate went out and instead went down to San Diego and bought Stone Brewing Company, so maybe they'll mess that one up too. But not bad. Anyway, good luck to everybody over at Anchor. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's see what happens, if anything, if I turn the radio on. And no, should not really do this. You should bring it up on a Variac. I'm worried less so with a tube radio, because if something really is going to go wrong, it's probably going to pop the little quarter-watt resistor that's in the filament chain. It acts like a fuse. At least the tuning string isn't broken. That'd be a pain. So far, I'm really not getting anything.
Term goals. You don't just provide cookie cutter portfolios? No. Thursday night game, watch LeBron.
That was wiped out and was destroyed.
There's not even a hum. It works really well, so that means one of two things. Either it means it's a Zenith, and it's all original, and because Zenith used high-quality components, it never had to be worked on. Or, at bare minimum, the filter capacitors went out and someone replaced those at some point. The last, most unlikely, and I'm saying this because of the physical condition of this, it's pretty filthy, is that it's never been, well, but it was fully recapped, fully restored. I seriously doubt that. This came out of a kind of a gross spider-infested shack. It's probably been there for a really long time. And so in order for me to get that answer, we're going to have to remove the back and take the chassis out. I'm also going to have to do something about these paper surrounds. The glue has gone to rock hardness, and so they're coming off. So we need to glue those back on too. And now to get the back off, there's these little friction clips you just pull out. You got to be careful with this cardboard because it is hardened up and become brittle with age. This is something that's interesting too. I've never seen this with this option, but you could get an attachment where you could hook up an additional speaker or hook up some headphones. I've never seen one with that. I'm assuming you could get it at the dealer. But the way that you remove these little clips is you just take a little pair of pliers and you just, I'm trying to do this one-handed and it's not working. Pull it out. And don't lose these. They're very easy to lose. So when I work on projects like this, I keep a little magnetic bowl on hand, even though I don't think these are magnetic. Actually, they are. I guess it must be bronze coated or something, or copper coated. So pull those off, and there's likely going to be an antenna loop attached to the back of this. And so I'll often unsolder that, because otherwise it's going to stay stuck to the chassis, and you risk the possibility of damaging it. All right, so now that we have the back removed, we can kind of see what's going on in here. It's a fairly basic rudimentary chassis. It's interesting to note, because even though this is a post-1955 model set, that we still have a traditional stamped metal chassis with direct wired components. And I'm saying that's kind of interesting because in the early 50s, PC boards started to show up. And there's an advantage from a cost and manufacturing perspective of using those, which is it's a lot cheaper. You know, obviously that phenolic plastic material they use for the boards is a lot cheaper than having stamped steel. And there's less labor involved with connecting the components. You could just put the components on and flow them through a solder bed, or I've seen videos of the old days when they did this, and they just flow them through a tank of molten lead to attach everything. Clearly that's a big money-saving operation. The problem was that these tubes get pretty hot, and they would degrade the phenolic material and become crispy and brittle, and the leads would start lifting. And Zenith was kind of like the Toyota of radios back then, and they did not want to go down that road. So they insisted on using hand-wired sets way up until like the 70s even. Even their TVs, when they started using PC boards, they would be put together with modules so that you could replace chunks of the TV without having to tear it apart. So they were pretty conservative, but as a result, their stuff was also more reliable. You had to pay a little bit more for it, but people knew that they were going to get a reliable product. Now, in order to get the chassis out, there's only two screws that hold it in. The speaker's bolted in, and you pull these cables off of the back of the speaker. That's important. The tricky part is dealing with the clock. And I'm trying to remember on this, I believe the clock would... Actually, I think the clock can pull out through the back. Am I imagining that correctly or not? I don't remember. It's been a while since I've worked on this. A lot of them, they've had this stupid design where you had to desolder all the wires and push the clock out through the front. Maybe it's not so on this one, but it's been a few years since I've worked on this model. We'll see. So now that I've pulled the chassis, I was reminded that yes, in fact, the clock can pull directly out from the back. But what you have to do is pull this cardboard cover off, and it's a quarter drive, and this will work just perfectly with my Exolite nut drivers. By the way, there's some things that are pricey but worth it, and Exolite tools are fantastic. I have a bunch of their stuff, some of which I've been using for probably over 20 years, to the point where if I lose any of them, like on the floor or anything like that, I'm like beside myself, because if you use a tool every single day of the week, it becomes like an appendage. Now there's the movement. That is a Telecron movement. It's, I think, again, one of my favorite clock movements. It's ingenious. It's ingenious because everything is so simple, but yet it works. This copper piece here, that is the rotor. And how it works is you see that we have these stacked steel plates. And there's a coil back here. And what that is that creates a magnetic field. And the magnetic field wraps around that drum, and it's going to create this movement. It's timed exactly to 60 hertz, which is standard US current, or standard, what is the thing I'm thinking about? Well, the hertz, basically. And so it's accurate so long as the guaranteed 60 hertz that comes out of the outlet is accurate. Now, if you were in Europe, they operate on 60 hertz. This would not be accurate at all. It would run too fast. But in the US, I have a bunch of these clocks around my house. Even though they're 60 years old, they don't lose any time, which is amazing considering it's just a stamped steel basic device. And I just have an appreciation for things that are utterly uncomplicated, but just do their jobs perfectly well. The clock is making a little bit of noise, so I might need to take the drum off and refresh it by giving it some new lube. We're going to remove these 2 screws here, and then the whole movement should come out in one piece. Now I have pulled the chassis completely out along with the clock. And if you're curious, yes, that is probably radium paint. And if you're not comfortable with radium, then don't do it. It's fine. I totally get it. From what I understand from radium is that it is, I'm trying to remember, it's not a beta source, so it won't go through your skin. The problem with radium is if you ingest it. And it's bad when the stuff is flaky. By the time you start getting into the 1950s, the amount of radium they used was very, very minimal compared to what they used to do. If you've seen the old watches from the 1920s, usually the paint is brown from the radiation literally cooking the paint, and it also flakes a lot. You can see this still looks pretty fresh. It's not peeling off or anything. So personally for me, I feel okay with that. I'm not going to lick it. I'm not going to scrape it or anything, but just be aware of it. Now, let's take a look underneath to see what this situation is here. And I can tell by looking immediately that this is, in fact, 100% factory original. And wow, look at that. Do you see this? I've never seen an electrolytic do that before. That is like, it's like shitting its innards out. I'm amazed that this actually still worked. But it did. So, but that definitely needs to be replaced. There are 2 values inside of that electrolytic capacitor. There is an 80 microfarad, as noted here, and a 40 microfarad. And there should be some shapes that indicate which is which. Is a square and a triangle. A square for 80, triangle for 40. And you'll find those by looking behind these tabs. Now I'm not going to be able to film this because, all right, you see that's a square. I'm not sure if you can see that. The other one by default is a triangle. So that's our 80 right here. This is our 40. Need to replace those 2 values with 2 individual electrolytic capacitors. The other thing that's really important on these guys, and I always try to emphasize this, is that a lot of people incorrectly say, well, that's a hot chassis. And you'd only be partially correct. It's actually a floating chassis. And what do I mean by floating? A true hot chassis would have one end of the power cord going to the steel chassis itself. Meaning if you were to touch this and ground, you would get every ounce of amperage that is possible coming out of your outlet directly to you. That's obviously very dangerous. You can get killed. So the manufacturers back then realized that's not very safe. We need to find a way to limit that amount of current coming out of the radio. And so what they did is one end of the line goes through a capacitor. In this case, it is this guy, and you can tell because it's connecting to the chassis here. It says it's an 047 microfarad capacitor. That's better than nothing. If I were to touch chassis and ground, I'd get like a zap and it would be uncomfortable. And since I'm a healthy, middle-aged man, I'd probably be okay. Probably being the operative word. Because this would not pass safety standards by today's standards, because it takes a lot less to cause a heart, especially a heart that is not as healthy, to fibrillate. And it's actually pretty low. So we're going to replace that capacitor with a 0.01 rated capacitor. And it's also going to be a different type. It's going to be an across-the-line capacitor. That's important. If the set gets struck by lightning, an across-the-line capacitor will split open. A regular capacitor might fuse solid, and then you would have a hot chassis again. So that's important. There's not a lot to replace here. They used mostly ceramic discs. There's only 2 paper caps, which is this and this. They're the same value, and again, this is the wrong value. We're going to replace that. The first thing I'm going to do is replace these 2 electrolytics. And what's really important to note here is that you see the can is sitting on top of a phenolic wafer, and that is essentially floating. It's not going to chassis. So your grounds for your electrolytics need to go on the grounds of this can, which you can see it's twist locked through this phenolic spacer. So I'll get out the modern electrolytic capacitors that's going to replace these and install those, and we'll give the set a test just to make sure. Still works. I mean, I could just probably shotgun this thing. There's not much to replace. But if you're especially newer to this hobby, it's not a bad idea to check your work every so often to make sure you don't get too far ahead of yourself and make a mistake that you have to backtrack and find. Well, I kind of have to admit I jumped the gun. Again, there wasn't that much to replace, but I went ahead and replaced the rest of the capacitors in here. So now we have the safety cap going to chassis ground, and then there were two others that were replaced. And so now they are good to go. So let's plug it in. I shouldn't assume anything, but it might possibly still work. So at least we got tube filament. That clock is very loud. It probably needs to be lubricated. I don't have an antenna hooked up, but I'll know if it's working probably just by making myself a little bit of the antenna temporarily. This seems like a very slow warming up radio. There we go.
It doesn't matter who you are or where you're.
That's interesting. There's no antenna connected, but it still is picking up stations. It's very sensitive.
I'll take them on the money line against the Padres. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, Padres. I know nothing about sports. They talk about this stuff and I'm like, am I supposed to care? Oh well. Anyway, the radio seems to be working nicely. And what I'm going to do next is clean the chassis. I know a lot of people think that's stupid because no one's going to see inside. It just makes me feel better knowing that it is clean. And then it's going to be time to address the cabinet, which is a little bit grimy. And I don't want to repaint it. I like the black bakelite, so you got to be careful when you clean these things. No harsh chemicals or cleaners, or you will dull the finish permanently, and then you can't do anything about it. So happy news is that the radio is very healthy and happy and working. And so let me unplug it here and get to work cleaning the chassis up. Okay, so the chassis is all cleaned up. Removed all the tube sockets, cleaned the tube sockets with a little contact cleaner. I don't know, it just makes me feel better knowing that the chassis is clean. But then again, I'm pretty OCD. So now we're going to lubricate the bearings here for the tuning condenser. You can see these ball bearings here. I put a little Zoom spout oil in it. And Zoom spout oil is pretty amazing. It's very different than 3-in-1 oil. Even though I'm not going to knock 3-in-1 oil because I've used good old 3-in-1 for many years. But this just is a much finer oil. It's very great for using on things like record players, tuning condensers, knob shafts, that kind of thing. Speaking of which, let's add a little bit to the volume control shaft. You just put a little bit on the outside like so, and then you work it in, and it just makes it feel nicer to the user, like it's a smoother action. You know, a lot of people bypass some of these things, but it's all about the tactile sensation. Like when this was new, it probably, both actions using either the tuner or the volume control felt very smooth. So we want to retain that original factory feel, so to say. So now we're in pretty good shape on the chassis. I'm going to move on to the cabinet here. And by the way, I wanted to say, like, I know that a lot of these episodes are really repetitive. I've been doing a lot of mass restorations for an upcoming auction, and I know that maybe some of these episodes have not been as thorough as they should be, and so I apologize for that. And I really appreciate you guys hanging out. And sometimes I think maybe I shouldn't do these videos anymore, but the fact that there's so many of you that watch and make such nice, kind comments, and by the way, I do read most of them, I really appreciate it. So thanks a lot, guys. I know there's a lot of other people doing this, but thanks for Thanks for hanging in with me. So now let's get to this cabinet. I think what I'm going to do is gingerly pull these paper labels off. They're paper with a little bit of probably a plastic coating of some sort, and then take this badge off. And then I need to see how much of this dirt can I remove just by running water over it. Again, you don't want to use anything harsh. We want to bring this back to its original factory sheen if possible. Alright, so now it's time to wax the case. I'm going to do something I haven't done before. I feel like the case is on the bleeding edge. If I were to go wash it with water and soap, it would probably ruin the Bakelite, so I'm going to try to just buff it out directly with wax without cleaning it. It's a new thing, so let me try to see if this works. Alright, this is what these typically look like when I'm in the middle of waxing. So yes, it looks pretty gross. I also use a toothbrush to kind of like get into some of these areas, get the wax in there. We need to let this dry, then we'll buff it out and see what it looks like on the other side. Alright, well this is pass number 1. The radio is very dirty, so I'm not sure what this is all about. It seems like something sat on top of here for a long time. And this is grime or something. So I think what I'm going to do is go after it with Novus number 2 plastic polish, which is slightly more abrasive than car wax. I think that'll probably get rid of some of this grime here. Alright, so this is the second pass, and it's looking a little bit better. Still not great. I don't like that I can't get any of the dirt from out of the corners. So what I've done is I've coated this in wax several times, enough to where I feel like I can go over to the sink with a paintbrush and some warm water, maybe some very, very mild soap, and get all the crud out of there and bring it back over here, because otherwise I can't really clean that up very well. Alright, well the cleaning kind of dulled the Bakelite a little bit, and so what I'm going to do is a last ditch effort, because at this point it cannot be painted. Once you get wax on one of these Bakelite jobs, it'll soak into the finish. You'll never be able to paint it. So what I use is a tire foam cleaner. I know it sounds stupid, but just gonna go over the whole thing. And just let that soak in. And that's gonna clean the surface and also kind of like quote unquote wet the surface a little bit to seal it up a little bit, and then I can go in there with some car wax to build on top of that. Alright, so we're getting a little bit closer. That tire cleaner stuff just basically cleaned more of the stuff off of there and returned some of that gloss, but we're going to go again at it with some Carnauba car wax and maybe some Novus number 2 plastic polish. Alright, well it's getting better, but this grill still needs a little work, so what I did is I got some Q-tips. Just dip it in a little wax here and just go into each and every one of these little slots and try to buff out all of the grime. Sometimes there's radios that I see and I remember, oh, that was a pain in the butt. Don't work on that again. And then I forget what the reason was. And I think with this radio, it's like if this very intricate grill gets dirty, it's very hard to clean and it's a lot of effort. So anyway, grab yourself a handful of Q-tips, go to town. Alright, so we got this cleaned up pretty good. Took a few passes, but I think that'll present pretty well. Again, the devil's in the details, but I think that'll turn out pretty good. Alright, so now that we've got this all polished up and everything, the next thing to do is to glue down the original plastic coated cardboard thingies, foils. This is the clock side, this is the left side. This side is the channel tuning side. And what I'm going to use is a product I've been using for years. It's called Lexel. It's like nice and gooey, sticks anything together. I've got parts of my truck held together with this thing. So equally it works well in radios. Alright, so after much elbow grease, I've gotten this case nice and clean and polished up. And so now what is left? What's left to do is to add the audio input feature that I add to all of these sets. And I'm going to show you how that's done in just a minute. Requires going through an isolation transformer so that the user is, as the name implies, electrically isolated from any potential current. Also, these little transformers help boost the signal just a little bit so you get a little more oomph out of the speaker. Alright, so here's how you do this. All we're going to do is run in through the sets of volume control. And the volume has a top, a bottom, and a center. And the bottom is the ground side, which is easy to tell. Here we have our grounded safety cap, so by default this means that is the bottom of the pot, and the top of it is underneath. I know it's hard to see here, but it's this white wire. And that white wire is coming off the first IF transformer, and that's what delivers the radio signal to the volume pot. And so what we're going to do is add a little switch that's between this connection and the volume, so that if someone wants to, say, listen to audio only, they can shut the radio signal off temporarily. And if they want to listen to the radio, then they flip that little switch back on and they get radio again. This is the isolation transformer. There's a primary and a secondary side. Primary is 120 volts in, and the secondary is 6 volts out. The primary goes towards the volume control. And because we're using a stereo cable, obviously it's not stereo. We're going to combine right and left channels together, so that'll make mono. And we're going to do that through a set of little resistors, 33 ohm resistors. And then we're also going to add another resistor to the primary side and a capacitor in series, so that the set's automatic gain control won't be messed with the transformer. We find these guys sometimes mess with the AGC. So, I know that probably doesn't make any sense, especially if you've never watched my channel before, but that's what we're going to do, and so I'm going to put that together and show you what that looks like, and then we'll try out a Bluetooth to make sure it still works. Okay, so now I've got the isolation transformer installed. This is not easy to see. Have a right and left channels going together through a set of resistors. The secondary side, the primary side goes to the top of the volume pot, and then we have a little switch wire coming out the back here to turn the radio signal off and on. And right now I've got a little Bluetooth module here running through the line in. It's working pretty good. The volume pot's a little scratchy, so I need to clean that up a little bit. But otherwise, we're firing on all cylinders. It's working the way it should. I do need to quieten this clock down. It's a little noisy, so I'll probably put a little oil on it. Alright, so I got it put back together again. It's all snazhed up. I'm going to let it play here for a while, make sure nothing's going to break down thermally. But this is the Bluetooth running through it. Likewise, I can just flip this little switch in the back here, and we get radio.
I think that's kind of
Sporting universe, I should say. But
We have this.
Speaking true flora.
Anyway, not much to it. It seems to work just fine, and it sure looks a lot better, because it was pretty grungy when I first started working on it. So now it looks pretty kind of regal. It's hot out here in this garage. We're having heat waves over 100 degrees, and none of the coastal houses here have air conditioning, and that includes ours. So I'm just going to, might wrap up radio working on for the rest of the day and try to stay cool. Might just sit in front of a fan drinking a beer. But in the meantime, this episode is completed, and I really appreciate you guys hanging on and watching. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave them below. And mash that like button. Or if you don't like it, press the dislike button. I'll never know, because they got rid of the dislike numbers, so I guess it'd make people feel better. But anyway, till the next time something crawls across the workbench, I'll see you guys next time. Adios!